The sun of the Madrid spring filtered through the windows of the royal Alcazar, as Philip IV, King of Spain and the Indies, gazed at the portrait of his grandfather, Philip II. At his age, the monarch felt the weight of a crown that was faltering. It was 1651, and the powerful empire he had inherited was slowly crumbling before his eyes. Portugal had declared its independence a decade earlier. Catalonia was in rebellion. France, his eternal enemy, was gaining ground in Europe. "Majesty, the Count Duke requests an audience," announced a chamberlain, interrupting his thoughts. Philip shook his head. "Inform him that I will not receive anyone today." The chamberlain withdrew with a bow. The king knew it was not the Count Duke of Olivares who sought to see him, as his former favourite had fallen from grace years before. It was simply the force of habit that led the servants to continue using that title when referring to matters of state. The monarch approached the Venetian mirror adorning the royal chamber. His elongated face, prominent jaw and drooping lower lip were distinctive Habsburg traits that had become more pronounced with each generation. A dynasty that had conquered Europe not through wars but through strategic marriages, following the motto, "Bella gerant alii, tu felix Austria nube." Let others wage war, you, happy Austria, marry. And marry they had, cousins with cousins, uncles with nieces, interweaving their bloodlines time and again until it became a dangerous genetic labyrinth. Philip knew this, though not in scientific terms. He saw it in the faces of his ancestors, in the portraits that filled the palace. He recalled the words of his father, Philip III, on his deathbed. "God, who has given me so many kingdoms, has denied me a son capable of ruling them." A curse that seemed to haunt the Habsburgs, and now, after the death of his heir, Prince Balthazar Carlos, Philip faced the same dynastic crisis. "I need an heir," he murmured to himself, his gaze settling on another portrait, that of his young niece, Mariana of Austria, whom he had married 3 years earlier. She was a girl of 14 when he wed her, he being 44. A union that would horrify any commoner, but was considered not only acceptable, but desirable among royalty. Mariana was the daughter of his sister, Maria Anna, and Emperor Ferdinand III, Philip's cousin. The blood ties could not have been closer. The queen had given birth to a daughter, Margaret Theresa, and was pregnant again. Philip prayed for a son, an heir to ensure the continuity of the dynasty in Spain. As he contemplated his young wife's portrait, he could not help but think of Isabel, his first wife, who had died 7 years earlier. Isabel of Bourbon, a French princess, had borne him several children, though only the Infanta Maria Theresa had survived. Isabel had been his second cousin, a relatively distant relation by Habsburg standards. The king's personal secretary, Antonio Carnero, entered the chamber after requesting permission. "Majesty, dispatches have arrived from Flanders and Naples, and the queen requests your presence." Philip nodded slowly. "I will take the dispatches to my study. I will visit the queen afterward." The monarch walked through the long corridors of the Alcazar, nodding to courtiers who bowed as he passed. All knew of the king's penchant for the arts and culture. Under his patronage, Velázquez had created masterpieces, and playwrights like Calderón de la Barca had brought Spanish theatre to its zenith. The Spanish Golden Age shone brightly, even as the empire's political power waned. In his private chambers, Philip reviewed the dispatches. Bad news, as usual. The royal coffers were empty, the armies underpaid, and the enemies growing stronger. He rubbed his temples, feeling the onset of a headache. His advisors had urged him to sign a peace treaty with France, recognize Portugal's independence, cede territories, in short, to accept that the Spanish Empire was no longer what it had been. How did we come to this? He asked himself, knowing the answer all too well. Decades of poor political decisions, costly and unnecessary wars, inefficient administration, and, though he did not know it with scientific certainty, the biological deterioration of the dynasty. As evening fell, Philip visited Queen Mariana's chambers. He found her praying at her prie-dieu, a rosary in her hands. At 17, she already displayed the seriousness and religious devotion characteristic of the Habsburgs. Seeing her husband and uncle, She rose with difficulty due to her advanced pregnancy. "Majesty," she greeted with a bow. "Do not rise," Philip replied, taking her hand to kiss it. "How are you feeling today?" "Well, thanks to God," she answered. "The child moves a great deal." Philip placed his hand on her swollen belly, feeling the kicks of the future prince or princess. "It will be a boy," he said with conviction. "God cannot abandon Spain in these difficult times." Mariana nodded, though her face betrayed concern. 2 previous pregnancies after Margaret Theresa's birth had ended in miscarriages. Infant mortality was high, even among royalty, but it seemed particularly elevated in the Habsburg family. "I have been reading about our ancestors," the Queen remarked. "It is astonishing how God has blessed our family with so many territories." Philip smiled bitterly, "And how he has cursed us with the inability to hold them." The young Queen lowered her gaze, uncomfortable. Though raised in the imperial court of Vienna, she was well aware of Spain's situation: the military defeats, the bankruptcy, the rebellions. Spain was exhausted after decades of constant warfare. "My father, the emperor, sends his regards," she said, changing the subject. "He trusts we will soon give him news of a prince's birth." Philip nodded distractedly. His brother-in-law and cousin, Emperor Ferdinand III, had his own troubles in the Holy Roman Empire. The Peace of Westphalia had significantly curtailed his power, and the German princes now enjoyed greater autonomy. After a brief conversation, the king took his leave and headed to his chambers. On the way, he paused at a window overlooking the gardens. The light of the setting sun bathed Madrid in golden hues, creating the illusion that all was still glorious and prosperous. But Philip knew the truth. Spain was bleeding dry in endless wars, while the court maintained a facade of splendor. Parties, spectacles, royal hunts, all designed to conceal the decay. "My God," the king murmured, "grant me a strong heir to save this monarchy." What Philip could not imagine was that his prayer would be answered, but not in the way he hoped. Fate would grant him a male heir, but in him all the consequences of generations of inbreeding would manifest. A prince who would go down in history as the Bewitched, the last and most tragic representative of the Habsburg dynasty in Spain. The autumn of 1661 brought an event that filled the Spanish court with joy: the birth of the long-awaited male heir. After years of waiting, prayers, and religious processions, Queen Mariana gave birth to a boy, baptized as Charles. The entire kingdom celebrated with fireworks, bullfights, and Thanksgiving masses. At last, the dynasty's continuity seemed assured. However, the initial joy soon gave way to concern. The young prince was weak, sickly, and struggled to feed. The royal physicians did not hide their unease from the king, though they softened their diagnoses to avoid alarming him excessively. "He is merely delicate, Majesty," explained Dr. Gaspar Bravo de Sobremonte, the royal physician. "With proper care, he will grow strong." Philip, now 56, and aware of his own mortality, wanted to believe these reassuring words, but deep down he felt something was wrong with his son. Little Charles did not resemble other royal infants he had known. His cries were weak, his movements scarce, his gaze dull. Queen Mariana, then 27, devoted herself entirely to her son's care. She forbade anyone unauthorized from approaching the prince, fearing infections or, worse, some curse. Superstition was rampant in the Spanish court, and any unexplained illness was quickly attributed to spells or curses. "The blood of the Habsburgs runs through his veins," the queen repeated to her ladies-in-waiting. "He will grow stronger in time." But time passed, and little Charles did not improve. At 2 years old, he could barely stand. At 4, he still did not speak clearly, and his prominent jaw made both feeding and speech difficult. Courtiers whispered, though never in the presence of the king and queen. The heir to the most powerful throne in Europe seemed to have serious physical and mental problems. In 1665, when Charles was just 4 years old, King Philip IV fell gravely ill. On his deathbed, the monarch confided his deepest fears to his wife. "I fear for the future of the monarchy, Mariana," he whispered weakly. "Our son is not well." The queen, holding back tears, tried to reassure him. He will improve, Philip. He is still young. With God's help. It is not God's will that has harmed our son, the king interrupted with surprising clarity. It is our own blood. We have been marrying within our family for too long. Mariana crossed herself, scandalized. Do not say that, my lord. These are marriages blessed by the church. Philip smiled sadly. The church blesses what we ask it to bless, especially when accompanied by generous donations. But not even the Pope can change the laws of nature. On September 17, 1665, Philip IV died, leaving a 4-year-old boy with severe health issues as his heir. Queen Mariana assumed the regency, supported by a council that included, among others, the President of the Council of Castile, the Vice-Chancellor of Aragon, the Archbishop of Toledo, and a representative of Spain's grandees. Young Charles II grew up in an oppressive environment, overprotected by his mother and surrounded by courtiers vying for power. His education was deficient, partly due to his own limitations and partly due to the disinterest of those tasked with preparing him to rule. At 6 years old, Charles was still unable to keep himself clean or eat independently. His jaw was so prominent that he could not fully close his mouth, leading to constant drooling. His legs were so weak that he could barely walk without assistance. The French ambassador, Pierre de Villars, described the young king in a dispatch to Louis XIV. He is so weak that he cannot sustain a conversation. He has a sickly appearance, an elongated and pale face, and an expression of complete dullness. He walks with difficulty and tires easily. It is hard to imagine he will live long. Yet against all odds, Charles survived. His mother's regency lasted until 1675, when, at 14, he was declared of age, a majority more nominal than real, as the young king remained incapable of governing effectively. The Spanish court split into factions fighting to control the monarch. On one side, the Queen Mother and her Austrian supporters. On the other, the Spanish nobility seeking to reduce foreign influence. Charles, physically and mentally frail, became a mere spectator in the governance of his own kingdom. At 18, it was decided that the king must marry to secure the succession. The chosen bride was Marie-Louise of Orléans, niece of Louis XIV of France. When the French princess arrived in Spain in 1679, she was horrified to meet her future husband. Marie-Louise found a sickly young man with an oversized head on a frail body, a jaw so prominent it prevented proper chewing, and a vacant stare that revealed his limited intellectual capacity. However, as a princess raised in dynastic duty, she accepted her fate. The marriage, predictably, produced no heirs. Marie-Louise died 10 years later, in 1689, possibly poisoned by court factions dissatisfied with her inability to produce an heir. Charles, then 28, remained physically childlike and unable to fully consummate the marriage. The Spanish court, desperate for dynastic continuity, quickly arranged a second marriage. This time, the chosen bride was Maria Anna of Neuburg, a princess from the Palatinate. The new queen was more ambitious and domineering than her predecessor, swiftly taking control of the court. But even Maria Anna could not solve the fundamental problem. The king was infertile, a direct consequence of centuries of inbreeding. The court physicians tried every remedy, from potions made with bull testicles to elaborate rituals involving baths in pigeon blood. All were futile. Meanwhile, European powers watched Spain's situation with keen interest. It was clear that Charles II would die without issue, leaving the vast Spanish Empire without a direct heir. France and Austria, in particular, began positioning themselves for the inevitable succession crisis. Charles, to the extent of his limited faculties, was aware of the gravity of the situation. "I am bewitched," he once confessed to his confessor, the Dominican friar Froilan Diaz. "Some curse prevents me from producing an heir." The notion that the king was under a spell gained traction in the superstitious Spanish court. Exorcisms were performed, seers consulted, and witches sought throughout the kingdom. In 1698, corpses were even exhumed in search of signs of witchcraft. What no one dared acknowledge was the true cause of the problem. Generations of consanguineous marriages had created a genetic disaster. Charles II's family tree showed that 14 of his 32 great-great-grandparents were also his ancestors through other lines. His coefficient of inbreeding was higher than that of a child born to a father and daughter. The Habsburg jaw, a hallmark of the dynasty, had reached grotesque proportions in him. His tongue was so large it barely fit in his mouth, hindering speech and eating. His immune system was so weak that any cold could be life-threatening. His mental development had stalled in childhood. By 1698, at 37 years old, Charles II looked like an old man. He could barely walk, suffered frequent seizures, and had lost nearly all his hair. Foreign ambassadors reported to their sovereigns that the Spanish king's end was near, and European powers intensified their diplomatic maneuvers. France promoted the succession rights of Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV, and Maria Theresa, Charles's half-sister. Austria supported Archduke Charles, son of Emperor Leopold I and grandson of Maria Anna of Austria, Philip IV's sister. Both candidates had blood ties to the Spanish Habsburgs, though the French candidate was more closely related, perhaps explaining Charles II's final preference. On his deathbed, aware that his death would end the dynasty that had ruled Spain for 2 centuries, Charles II signed a will naming Philip of Anjou as his successor. It was his last act as king, one that would alter the course of European history. "May God forgive me," he murmured before drawing his final breath on November 1, 1700. "I have been a poor king for Spain." With his death, the Spanish branch of the Habsburg dynasty was extinguished, a victim of its own matrimonial policies. Spain, which under Charles V had been Europe's hegemonic power, became a prize to be divided among the great powers, triggering the War of the Spanish Succession. Charles II's tragedy was not only personal, but shaped the fate of entire nations. A fate sealed centuries earlier when his ancestors decided that the purity of royal blood outweighed the health of their descendants. In the halls of El Escorial, where the remains of the Spanish Habsburgs rested, silence reigned. Courtiers solemnly observed Charles II's coffin, the last representative of a dynasty that had dominated Europe for centuries. It was the year 1700, and an era was ending. Among those present was Antonio de Ubila, secretary of the Universal Dispatch, who had witnessed the late king's final political act, the signing of the will that handed the Spanish crown to Philip of Anjou, grandson of Louis XIV of France, a document that would reshape Europe's map and spark an international war. "So ends the House of Austria in Spain," murmured the Duke of Medinaceli, "with a king who could not produce heirs and who hands the kingdom to our traditional enemies." Ubila replied softly, "His Majesty considered all options. The French candidate was the lesser evil." The truth, which both knew but did not voice openly, was that the final decision had been the result of court intrigues, international pressures, and Charles II's own inability to resist external influences. The last Spanish Habsburg had been little more than a puppet in the hands of rival factions during his lifetime. As the king's body was placed in the royal crypt, where it would remain until its final transfer to the Pantheon, courtiers reflected on how one of history's most powerful dynasties had reached such a pitiful end. The answer lay written in Charles II's very DNA, though the science of the time was far from understanding genetic mechanisms. What they did grasp, through simple observation, was that marriages between close relatives had devastating consequences. The Habsburg family tree was an intricate maze where the same individuals appeared repeatedly in different branches. Joanna of Castile, known as Joanna the Mad, appeared 5 times in Charles II's lineage. Philip I, the Handsome, appeared 6 times. Each generation had tightened the circle, marrying cousins to cousins, uncles to nieces, reducing genetic diversity to dangerous levels. The result was Charles II, a man-child with severe physical and mental deformities. His lower jaw was so prominent that he could not close his mouth or chew properly. His oversized tongue made speech difficult. His elongated head and prominent forehead contrasted with his frail body and weak legs. Internally, his organs were misaligned. He suffered chronic digestive problems, and his immune system was so weak that any minor infection could prove fatal. Mentally, he never progressed beyond the development of an 8- or 9-year-old. He learned to read and write with great difficulty and could never govern effectively. Political decisions were made by his mother, his wives, or his ministers, depending on who held the most influence at the time. Despite 2 marriages, Charles II could not produce heirs. An autopsy revealed that his testicles were black as coal and his heart the size of a peppercorn, according to one of the attending physicians, a likely exaggerated description, but one that reflected the monarch's general physical deterioration. In the weeks following the funeral, the Spanish court split between those who accepted the will, favoring the French candidate, and those who preferred Archduke Charles of Austria. The European powers also took sides. England, Holland, and Austria formed the Grand Alliance to prevent the Spanish crown from falling into French hands, fearing the immense power this would grant Louis XIV. France, meanwhile, swiftly accepted the will. Philip of Anjou travelled to Madrid, where he was proclaimed king as Philip V, ushering in the Bourbon dynasty in Spain. The War of the Spanish Succession had begun, a conflict that would last 13 years and redraw Europe's political map. Far from the battles and diplomatic negotiations, in the laboratories of Enlightenment Europe, some scientists began to take an interest in the mechanisms of heredity. More than a century would pass before Gregor Mendel formulated the basic laws of genetics, and nearly 2 centuries before the concepts of recessive and dominant genes were understood. But there was already an intuition that something in the blood was passed from parents to children, and that this transmission could be negatively affected when parents were closely related. In the German kingdoms, where the Austrian branch of the Habsburgs continued to rule, these lessons were partially heeded. While they continued to practice marriages between related royal families, they avoided the most extreme cases of consanguinity. The Spanish Bourbons, for their part, diversified their matrimonial alliances, seeking consorts from different European royal houses. The tragedy of Charles II and the end of the Habsburg dynasty in Spain served as a warning of the dangers of extreme inbreeding, a warning that was not always heeded. Other European royal houses continued similar practices, though generally less intense, well into the 19th century. The most notable case was that of haemophilia in European royal families, transmitted through Queen Victoria of England to various reigning houses via her daughters. This genetic disease affected, among others, Tsarevich Alexei Nikolaevich, son of the last Russian Tsar, indirectly contributing to the fall of the Romanov dynasty during the Russian Revolution. In Spain, meanwhile, the new Bourbon dynasty undertook profound reforms to modernize the country. Philip V, despite initial resistance, managed to stabilize his reign after the War of the Spanish Succession. He introduced a centralized model of government inspired by France, revitalized the economy, and reformed the army and navy. The Bourbons brought Enlightenment ideas, albeit adapted to Spain's reality and always under the control of absolute monarchy. This was known as enlightened despotism, encapsulated in the phrase, "everything for the people, but without the people." Spanish society underwent significant changes during the 18th century. The Catholic Church's influence, though still immense, began to be questioned in certain circles. The Inquisition, so powerful under the Habsburgs, gradually lost relevance. The sciences and arts received a new impetus. However, the memory of Charles II and the Habsburg dynasty lingered in the collective consciousness. Portraits of the House of Austria's kings, with their prominent jaws and melancholic gazes, adorned royal palaces as a testament to a glorious yet tragic past. A past when Spain had dominated half the world, but also suffered the consequences of disastrous dynastic decisions. The 19th century brought new challenges for Spain: the Napoleonic invasion, the independence of the American colonies, the Carlist Wars, and military coups. But the lesson of the Habsburgs was not entirely forgotten. The importance of genetic diversity, though not understood in scientific terms, became ingrained in the consciousness of European royal houses. The story of Philip IV and Charles II became a case study for geneticists and physicians. Portraits by Velázquez and other court painters provided a visual record of the progressive deformation of Habsburg features across generations. The prominent jaw, known as prognathism, grew more pronounced with each monarch, reaching its most extreme expression in Charles II. In modern Spain, these portraits hang in the Prado Museum as a reminder of an era when dynastic marriages took precedence over health or personal well-being. an era when kings and queens were, above all, pieces on a political chessboard, played on a continental scale. The legacy of the Spanish Habsburgs is complex and contradictory. Under their rule, Spain reached the height of its international power and experienced its cultural golden age. Yet their endogamous matrimonial policy led to the dynasty's physical and mental degeneration, contributing to its extinction and the decline of the Spanish Empire. Philip IV, as the monarch who chose to marry his niece Mariana of Austria, bears some historical responsibility for the genetic disaster that was Charles II, though he was merely following a long-established family tradition. Judging him by modern standards would be anachronistic. The genetic knowledge that allows us to understand the consequences of inbreeding today was unknown in the 17th century. What we can judge is the dynastic system that prioritized political considerations over individual well-being, a system that treated royal family members not as people but as tools to maintain and expand power. Habsburg princesses were pawns on the European chessboard, married to uncles, cousins, or nephews as dynastic interests dictated. Their bodies belonged to the lineage, serving as reproductive machines to produce heirs and preserve pure blood. This system reached its breaking point with Charles II. His body, deformed by centuries of inbreeding, rebelled against the fate assigned to it. Unable to produce heirs, he inadvertently ended the dynasty that had created him. The Spain that emerged after the War of the Spanish Succession was transformed. Under the Bourbons, administrative reforms centralized power. The army and navy were modernized, the economy revitalized, and Enlightenment ideas introduced, albeit under monarchical control. The absolutist Bourbon model, inspired by France, laid the foundations for the modern Spanish state. The administration became more professional, territorial councils lost power to state secretaries, and efforts were made to rationalize the chaotic fiscal structure inherited from the Habsburgs. However, the Bourbon reforms could not prevent the independence of Spain's American colonies in the 19th century. Spain, which under Charles V and Philip II had been a global empire, was reduced to a second-tier power with possessions in the Caribbean, the Philippines, and North Africa. The history of the Spanish Habsburgs, from Charles V to Charles II, is one of meteoric rise followed by a gradual but inexorable decline, a decline driven by political, economic, and military factors, but also by the dynasty's biological degeneration. The lineage that had dominated Europe for centuries vanished from Spain with Charles II's death. Its legacy, however, endured in the cultural heritage of the Golden Age, in the territorial configuration of modern Spain, and in the portraits of monarchs with their characteristic prominent jaws. The tragedy of Philip IV and Charles II reminds us that even the most powerful are subject to the laws of nature, that political power, no matter how great, cannot defy biological principles with impunity, and that decisions made in one generation can have devastating consequences for those to come. In the end, the story of the Spanish Habsburgs is a warning about the dangers of dynastic arrogance and a reminder of our shared humanity. Kings or commoners, we are all subject to the same natural laws, and sooner or later, nature exacts its price from those who seek to defy it. As visitors to the Prado Museum gaze at the portraits of Philip IV and Charles II today, they can reflect on how past political decisions shaped not only history, but also the biology of a dynasty, and how ultimately biology imposed its limits on politics, bringing an end to one of Europe's most powerful royal houses. This is the final lesson of the story of Philip IV and Charles II. That human power, no matter how great, always finds its limits in the immutable laws of nature, a lesson that, centuries later, remains relevant in a world where political arrogance continues to challenge natural limits with potentially catastrophic consequences for future generations.